Have you felt like you have a tendency to procrastinate more than usual lately? Have you felt a general drop in libido or attraction to your partner? Or perhaps you have noticed that you're having a harder time with concentration and focus? Well, believe it or not, but these are just a few examples of what can happen if you consume a lot of online porn. Hi, I am Scandinavian Bob, and I am not religious. Now I feel a need to start off like that, because a lot of people can become defensive if they hear anything bad about porn, thinking that what they hear is just moral preaching from some religious person. And that's quite understandable, because there is also a lot of moral preaching going on out there. But no, not here, because this is not about shaming. I'm just a guy who was severely affected by porn, and who, after I found out what it was doing to me, tried to give it up for more than 7 years before I finally managed to do so. In other words, I was addicted to porn. And in this video series, I'm going to share with you how porn can change the brain, and more importantly, how you can change it back. And this is something I believe everyone should know about, because although these brain changes are most common in people with a real porn addiction, you should know that, first of all, addiction is not an on-off thing. You can be more or less addicted. So you can have mild addiction-related brain changes going on without even knowing it. And some of the things you are about to discover can even affect people who are not addicted. So if you're not affected by any of this, you most likely have someone in your family or circle of friends who is. So please stay with me here, because I promise you, this is something you really have to know. But before we start, here's the always appropriate disclaimer.
Disclaimer. This video series is information only and it's not medical advice. If you need medical advice, please see a doctor. I am not a doctor. I'm just a guy who has read and learned a lot in order to be able to overcome my own addiction. But again, I am not a doctor.
Alright, so if this is the first time you're hearing about this, you might be surprised to know that watching too much online porn actually can cause things like I mentioned in the start. But it is absolutely true. And before we move on, I also need to make it clear that I am specifically talking about online porn here, because it is actually not so much the porn in and of itself that's the problem. It is when we combine it with today's delivery system that it can become problematic. In other words, the internet. So for example, back in the day, those old porn magazines were not potent enough to cause any problems, or the old VHS tapes. But today, everyone obviously consumes porn on the internet, and therein lies the problem. Because with online porn, there is endless novelty, which means you can keep your dopamine levels elevated with the click of a mouse, basically as long as you want. And by doing so, you can override your natural satiation mechanism. You see, your ancient reward system did not come equipped with being able to handle all that stimuli. Think about it. It is now possible for a porn user to see more hot babes in one single porn session than his ancestors were able to see in several lifetimes. You can see more naked babes than they could see in several hundreds of lifetimes even. All with a click of a mouse. Searching, clicking, getting dragged along to the next clip and the next clip and the next, fast forwarding with multiple tabs open, all while keeping the dopamine levels sky high for sometimes hours on end. We are going to talk more about exactly why that's a problem a bit further on, but with this I think most of you already can start to see how that could perhaps not be such a healthy thing to do. So let's now take a look at some of the most common negative effects that online porn can cause, so that you know why I feel so strongly about the importance of learning this. Watching a lot of porn can cause people to experience increased fear and anxiety, lack of motivation and drive, delayed ejaculation. In other words, they have trouble climaxing when with a real partner. A sensation of having dulled senses. Porn-induced erectile dysfunction. Yes, you may have heard that porn can cause erection problems. And perhaps you've been wondering, is that really true? And I'm here to tell you that yes, it is really true. And by the way, the delayed ejaculation thing here is just one step ahead in the process before developing PIED. So if you're noticing having problems with that, be happy that you found out about it now so that you can stop the porn before porn-induced ED develops. It is like Dr. Carlo Foresta, the head of the Italian Society of Andrology and Sexual Medicine said, quote, "It starts with lower reactions to porn sites. Then there is a general drop in libido, and in the end it becomes impossible to get an erection." Unquote. Yeah, and he was one of the first experts to notice this phenomenon just a few years after high-speed internet with streaming tube sites had entered the market. Now, porn-induced ED happens because of two things. The first one is desensitization, and that's the one that Dr. Foresta talked about in the quote there. But then there is also sexual conditioning at play here, meaning you have conditioned your brain to respond more to pixels on a screen than to real-life people. You see, whenever your dopamine levels are high, your brain is a learning machine because it interprets elevated dopamine levels as the situation being vital for survival. And remember when I just said that with online porn, it is possible to keep your dopamine levels elevated for as long as you want with the click of a mouse. And since the brain is a super learner during times of elevated dopamine, if you then are sitting there clicking from video to video while you at the same time are also masturbating, well then your brain is going to start to pair your libido with pixels on a screen. This is sexual conditioning, and it's why we say that porn can hijack your real libido. It is like Gary Wilson used to say, you are training for the wrong sport. Yes, and so watching a lot of porn can also cause brain fog and concentration problems, social anxiety. It can also cause low energy and low mood. Yes, people who are very addicted to porn often feel like nothing in life can deliver any pleasure any longer, except for porn. And often even the porn stops working after the addiction progresses. In other words, depression and anhedonia can become a problem. By the way, anhedonia is simply a condition where you are incapable of feeling pleasure. It is like Anna Lemke, one of the world's leading addiction experts, says, quote, "Ironically, chasing pleasure for pleasure itself often leads to anhedonia." Unquote. And porn can also cause low libido, especially for real-life people, like I already mentioned. It can cause morphing sexual taste. And this is often because by watching a lot of porn, people quickly escalate and start watching more and more extreme stuff in order to get the same kick. This is also due to desensitization, by the way. Another way to put desensitization is that you get a numb pleasure response. Now, there are more potential negative consequences than these, but these are the ones that are the absolute most common ones we see people who watch online porn can start developing. Alright, so now let's move on to the next section of this video, where we will take a look at the 4 fundamental brain changes that happen in any addiction and that are behind many of these negative symptoms that I just shared. Please pay attention now, because this is going to be so important for you to discover. The 4 brain changes are: 1. Desensitization. 2. Sensitization. 3. Hypofrontality. 4. Malfunctioning stress system. Alright, so we already touched a bit on desensitization. But let's take a deeper dive into the mechanism of how that happens. And in order to do so, I'm going to share a short clip from another presentation I made for a course a while back. So here goes. This, ladies and gentlemen, is desensitization.
Alright, so we are back on the animation board and now we are going to take a look at the desensitization process. In other words, what can happen if you keep overusing instant gratification, super stimulating things. So what you are looking at here is a part of the dopamine system in action. To the left we have the sending neuron and to the right the receiving neuron. See those small dots there? Well, that is our friend dopamine right there. And dopamine does its magic by attaching to the small dopamine receptors here, the small slots that the dopamine molecules fit perfectly into. And when dopamine has sparked into those, it is then we feel the effects of dopamine. Now, what happens if we expose our brain to very stimulating things is that the brain starts going, oh no, now there's too much dopamine here. I need to protect myself from it. And it does so by reducing the number of dopamine receptors, as you can see on the animation eraser right now. And the thing is, with less dopamine receptors, those small dopamine molecules now have less slots to park into, which means we feel less effects of whatever dopamine a certain activity gives us. Just a short example here. Let's say that a certain activity gives you a certain amount of fun and pleasure. And let's just for the sake of this example come up with a unit for that fun and pleasure. Let's call the unit FN. As in, fun. Okay, so then let's say that every Wednesday night you have band practice where you play your musical instrument. And that activity is giving you, let's say, 56 FN. Well, if you desensitize your reward system by, for example, watching way too much porn, now when you go to your band practice, even though the sending neuron is sending you 56 FN, it will only feel like maybe 39 FN, because you now have less of those small dopamine receptors. And the scary part here is a receptor, meaning this feeling less effects of dopamine is now gonna be true for every single activity you do. Every single activity, not just music or porn or whatever, but every single activity. This is the neurobiological process behind desensitization, also known as getting a numb pleasure response or a disrupted dopamine system.
Alright, so that is the mechanism behind desensitization. And now you also understand why I said that the fact that you can keep clicking from video to video, keeping your dopamine levels elevated for a very long time can become problematic, because it can reduce the number of your dopamine receptors. And you should know that those receptors do not instantly grow back. No. It can sometimes take weeks to months, depending on the situation and the addiction and the person. And this is only if the person quits or drastically reduces his use, of course, which is a must if he wants them to grow back at all. Now, in the midst of my own porn addiction, I was severely affected by desensitization myself. And believe me when I say, if you keep digging that hole deeper and deeper with more and more instant gratification, you can turn your situation into complete hell, because everything in life will start to feel gray and boring. Well, that's a good definition of hell right there. So yeah, I'm not exaggerating here. And the disrupted dopamine system you just saw is also the biggest reason behind why watching a lot of porn can give you things like low motivation and drive, social anxiety, lack of concentration, and many of the things we started off the video by looking at. Yes, it's true, because you see, dopamine is highly involved with, for example, motivation and drive. In fact, dopamine is the very go after it neurotransmitter. So if your dopamine system is not working properly, it will be super difficult to muster up any motivation and drive at all. And yes, dopamine is also involved with concentration and focus, and it can play a part in anxiety as well, and so on. So desensitization is the biggest problem that can be caused by online porn. Alright, so in order to not make this video too long, we will take a look at the rest of the brain changes and how to deal with all of that in part 2 of this series. You can see that video on the screen right here, and if you can't see it yet, it just means that I'm still working on it and it will be out in just a few days from now. But click on that right now and I'll see you over there.